why not?
Alright. Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler. Today, we're doing a bit of a variety hour. A lot of the people we like are in between projects, and we've got some big stuff coming up. But for now, it's just us, baby. Us, baby.
Yep. To
Um,
be clear, we have a big stream plan that I think everybody will enjoy, and
oh, yeah.
it's gonna be fun. So, but not yet.
Yep. And, that's the sort of thing we're going for. Right now, like I said, a bunch of people are in between projects or ginning up projects. Uh, so it just takes a moment for people. Takes a
Exactly.
moment. Hmm.
So, as we play this, I'm in the final minute of a chess game that I am losing very badly.
D-
Uh, because I was trying to rush through it to get it done before this started. It did not work. I did not finish, and I lost. So, win, win, win. Uh,
wow.
hey, I didn't technically lose yet. Uh, it can happen. Crap. It's not good. Okay. What do I do? What do I do, Ben?
You want to move your pawn on. Uh,
We're going for stalemate
E.
strats, baby.
You want to move your pawn that's on E4 up one.
What do I do? Oh crap! He accidentally gave away his rook. What an idiot. Uh,
I'm trying to get a game to play on this. It's kind of a late thing for us today. Uh, no, but we looking through things, we do have a couple of things that we can talk about. We do have something that'll come up next week, but it requires me to do some reading, and that's just kind of a lot to ask me. Uh, so one of the things that we have a mutual interest in is the missing 411. David Politis wrote a book called The Missing 411, if I recall it correctly. And it's basically going over missing persons cases that are mysterious. Um, Basically, it's people who are experienced, usually young men to older men. Um, not these aren't like super poor people. These aren't dregs of society. These are middle class, upper middle class. Um, who though some younger men as well and boys who disappear, and some women, I guess, but less statistically improbable, who disappear under mysterious circumstances. David Politis does get some flack for being a Bigfoot believer, but quite frankly, I've seen enough evidence myself to believe that even if it's not Bigfoot, there's something that's ape-like running around. Um, there's too many stories with too many agreements to say that um, that there's absolutely nothing out there. But the problem
yeah.
is that he gets some flack. Yeah, what's up, Anthony?
I was gonna say I can't really mock anyone for being a Bigfoot believer. Like I completely unironically and very seriously believe in Fae. Like at the very least, I consider the existence of Fae to be more statistically likely than not, due to
Mm,
the vast array of like the vast majority of human experience has affirmed the existence of Fae from time immemorial to now.
yep.
Uh, so just on the basis, and by Fae, generally what I mean is non-human and non-angelic sapient species uh, that are probably spiritual in nature, though it's unclear if they are only spiritual in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's what I mean by Fae, and when that's what most people mean when they talk about like the fairy world. They're talking about spirits that are neither angels nor demons nor disembodied humans. Uh, you're not required to believe in them. Like to be a Christian, for example, there's nothing that says you need to believe in the fairy world. I just think that because the vast majority of human experience has affirmed the existence of Fae, it is more likely than not. I mean, I suppose
Yep.
there are other. So I can't mock someone for believing in Bigfoot. I haven't looked into the Bigfoot lore, but I would be willing to believe in some sort of ape-like hominid in the Pacific Northwest. Like, there's no reason for me not to.
Yeah, and
Uh,
that's really what I'm saying. Uh, a lot of people, say a lot of things, but like that's what we're talking about.
hmm
Oh well.
Now I do know. So I know Missing 411 through Lore Lodge. Uh, Yeah, by the way, before I forget, I'm going to cut myself off to remember something that I had mentioned because I was talking with my sister, who, for those who don't know, voices Control. She has a Pinkerton's and writes the Control stories, so she has a Pinkerton's ghost connection. Anyway, I was talking with my sister about this, and I mentioned to her that the Quran mentions jinn, like DJINN, genies, right? And I told her I think that jinn probably exists in some capacity, and she was like, "Really?" I said, "Well, sure. Like the idea of fae that grant wishes in some sense, right? Like,
Yes.
is a very old one. That they give it the name jinn seems reasonable to me, right? Like,
Yep.
so I don't, so yeah, like unless you gave me very good evidence that jinn uh, don't exist, they don't seem to be. The only other possibility that would explain the concept of fae to me is that they are entirely angelic and entirely demonic. But
Yep.
even then, you might just be splitting terms as I'm thinking out loud here, because angels are not a species of creature, right? Angel means messenger, they're spiritual messengers. So to call something part of the fairy world and to call something an angel might just be using two different terms for the same basic idea, right?
Yep.
Like, so we might even just be talking past each other in that point. Uh, I'm thinking out loud as I'm saying this, but like I also believe, for example, like, and I think I showed you an article on this, Ben, like several months ago, in the concept of the muse,
Yep.
which is an external force that uh, brings ideas into the heads of writers. I think that the most likely explanation for this is inspiration of the Holy Spirit and writers and
Yes.
poets. Yeah. But certainly, I think that the concept of external force that brings ideas into the heads of writers and poets is real. It is
Yes.
very well attested in history through many different cultures. Uh, I just think that it is likely to be the Holy Spirit, but I'm not wed to that. It could be some sort of lesser spirit that God has ordained for that task.
The highest version of it is certainly from the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, well, that's the inspiration of Scripture, of course, right?
Yes.
Like, uh, in fact, yeah. Now that I think about it, that's interesting. I wonder if you can make something out of that. But whatever. Going back to the missing 411 cases, I follow Lore Lodge. He
Yep.
has a series on it, so I just started following him uh, because Ben mentioned him in passing, actually. So I looked up his channel and I thought it was interesting.
They
Watched a
follow us
few
on
videos.
Twitter.
Yeah, me too.
Oh.
Uh, so he is good. He has a very nice video on Sound of Freedom. If you haven't seen it,
Yes.
where he looks into the claims of Sound of Freedom. If anything, I actually think he's a little bit harsh on the movie, but he's very fair. Uh, I think he's probably harsher than he needs to be. Like, he says a few times that, the movie could have made this clear or that clear, and I think he's holding it to a standard that Hollywood movies are not generally held to. Uh, so even on that, like, I don't entirely agree with him, but it's a good video and I recommend it.
Mm.
But his missing 411 stuff is good. So I heard him. I only know about what's his name, David Polanski. Is that it?
David Politis.
Politis. Okay. I only know David Politis because he mentions him a few times. And interestingly, Lore Lodge himself seems to have kind of a middling opinion of Politis. Uh, as he talks about him, he
Mm.
mentions that he uses Politis as a source, but he also mentions more than once that you should definitely not trust all of Politis's details.
Yes.
That, like, he does not he doesn't do enough fact checking, basically.
He's a
Uh,
he's a self-serving sometimes. That's a good way to put it without being insulting. Like he does a lot of work, and if he has things to decide on, he tends to do the one which agrees with his premises.
yeah, yeah. I think that's fair. Just going by how I've heard Lore Lodge and also Wendigoon talks about similar types of stories. This wasn't Missing 411 since it's a Lore Lodge series, but Wendigoon recently had a great video on the five boys that disappeared up a mountain.
The Yuba
Uh,
City Five.
yeah, thank you, the Yuba City Five. Uh,
Hmm.
he had a great video on the Yuba City Five. The some when the video was good. Wendigoon gave his theory at the end of it. Uh, but the missing 411 phenomenon. So here's the thing: what makes this difficult is that even in the missing 411 cases, the vast majority of them are still probably something fairly mundane, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
drunk people and somebody gets lost. Now, to make it into missing 411, you need to have enough interesting points about it that it's worth like talking about. you know, but even then, I've just noticed listening to it that I would tend to believe less fantastic explanations for most of these.
Yes.
For example, one of them was a girl. So this actually was, there you go, a girl, a young girl, in fact. I think she was only like 14 or something. I'm going to try and find it in my YouTube search history so I could give you a name because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But essentially, she was with her father and she separated. She was hiking in an area that she knew well. She was going to meet up with
Yes.
her father. And she just completely disappeared after meeting some 70, like I think they said somewhere, some old man in his 70s. Uh, she just disappears after that, and nobody knows why, because the government won't release information about it,
Yep.
citing like. And I actually think that the answer is probably pretty mundane to me. And I was going by the comments, and I was reading the comments, and I agree with this. What most likely happened is that this little girl slipped, fell, hit her head, and drowned. And they didn't want to admit that they completely missed this for a very long time
Yes.
because it's a very obvious answer and it is unconscionable. Like, if they missed it, that alone would be reason to hide it because it's completely unconscionable.
Yeah.
Unconscionable. Wow. That they would miss it.
Yep. And there's
And it's
a
like, it's not a very interesting answer, I understand, but, like, it just makes the most sense to me. It explains pretty much everything very easily.
and that's kind of the key for it. Like some of these things do have strange events tied to them. I found out missing 411 through bedtime stories, which is a great channel also, and is in fact part of it is this is the start of Pinkerton's Ghosts. Listening to these stories, listening to Night Vale and the Magnus archives, and then putting it together for a more realistic look with things like the missing 411, though, these are real people who have died. They've disappeared. They no longer exist. A couple of them, are as simple as disappearances. I think one came back alive, though his, disappearances are a mystery, though I heard he recently rediscovered his memory. Who knows? Um, I don't trust it 30 years on, if you ask me. You also have some things which are clearly signs of conspiracy. Um, Recently, there was the death of Sinead O'Connor. She spoke
Yeah.
out against Catholic priest abuse. And of course, we'll say this as a typical boilerplate. This isn't a stick to hit Catholics with. Public schools do way worse things at greater numbers, but it is a thing. It is a problem. Uh, and so she got a lot of criticism for it. But she was part of the Hollywood set and a few other things, even though she wasn't like, inner circle or anything like that. It was just kind of where she was, as I understand it. Uh, but with Bobby Bizzop, it's pretty clear that through either direct action or indirect action, he was killed by a priest who was later proven to be, a sex abuser, pedophile, uh, and homosexual. Uh,
Mhm.
However, there's no direct evidence for what actually happened. There's some people saying some things that, oh, he looked uncomfortable, he looked embarrassed, you know, coincided with a child who has just been, say, flashed. Uh, but the but there's not enough evidence to say exactly what it was. Somebody had his skull in their basement and they didn't know what to do with it until they just came forward on the police. There's so many weird and supposedly given to him by
So
an archbishop. Like, you look at
yeah.
all these things, it's so weird. But
So here's the thing that Wendigoon mentioned once that is important to remember, and he's absolutely right about this. He
yeah,
goes like, you start to see the propaganda more when you look into real cases, because
the what?
propaganda is like cop propaganda.
Oh,
That's shows like, and I'm referring to shows literally like NCIS, CSI, uh, any of those types of shows, right?
yes,
Start to see it more when you start seeing real cases, because Wendigoon pointed this out. It is unbelievable how incompetent like real
yes.
investigations can be. Like, you would be amazed, things that you wouldn't be able to write into like um you wouldn't be able to write it into a movie or a book or something, because they would go, no, they would never miss that, right? Like,
So
it doesn't
so
make any sense,
so here's a
and they just
story.
do.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, here's a story I love. The father of DNA testing contaminated most of his sources with his own DNA because he picked them up with his hands.
Yeah, just, it's ludicrous.
Yeah,
It even gets into, by the way, I found the case that I was talking about, Stacey Aris.
I
It
don't
even gets
remember
into,
that one.
like, I'm reading the comments on the Stacey Aris case,
Yeah,
and there's someone going, oh, it was probably they were killed and they don't want to admit it because that explains why they're not releasing the details, because they don't want to, like, they're worried it would hurt the investigation.
yeah,
Now, I don't agree with that, actually. That is plausible,
yeah,
right? Like, it's a possibility, but that's why I said, like, I'm using Occam's razor here, which is the far more likely explanation to me is that she died in a very common boilerplate way, tragic accident,
yep,
right? She hit her head and drowned. And they definitely should have thought of this quickly and found her quickly. Depending on how she died, possibly even saved her life. Like, if it were an injury, they could have possibly saved her. If
yep,
she drowned, no, but who knows? Uh, right? And they messed up and didn't think to check this until way later, and that's really embarrassing. So they don't want to admit it.
yep.
Like, that is Occam's razor more plausible to me than they're covering up a murder.
And
Now, could they be covering up a murder? Yes. Like,
yeah,
don't get me wrong, that's not outside of the realm of possibility. And Occam's razor only deals with probabilities. It doesn't, it shouldn't be used to, like, say, well, we've ruled that out,
yep.
right?
And the
It's not
things.
ruled, it's not ruled out, but
Oh yeah,
there's an easier answer. The easier answer is they were incompetent.
yep. Like, the things I've heard about, the police force in my own city, it's like, no, like, I firmly believe the police mess stuff all the time. They're nice people, at least the ones I interact with, when they're not having to, do their jobs. But, and I guarantee you some of them would, spend every effort trying to save a kid who's lost in a park or something like that. But you also, like, they're human. They're not really trained for, like, stuff like searching every nook and cranny of a forest. Which brings us to the park rangers and the RCMP. But so it's like police missing things all the time. Yeah, no, that's the normal thing. Now the RCMP is malicious. They must be malicious from all the stuff I've heard. Uh, Besides, them being an arm of the government for the trucker thing, but
Yeah, and I've noticed this, like, most of the stories are of this type of Like, honestly, the most plausible solution to me is the boring one of the government was just really incompetent.
Mm,
Not all of them, though, and that's where it gets interesting, right? Like,
right.
uh, the Eloise Lindsay case is an example where, are you aware of that one off the top of your head or no?
Which one was it?
Eloise Lindsay?
I don't remember that one at all. I'll probably
So,
like I might remember when you tell me the events.
sure. Eloise Lindsay was hiking, right, as all of these are, and she disappeared, and they had a search, and they sent out a search for her, and she was actually found alive, some amazingly, like in a bad state but alive. And the story that she gave in a press conference afterward is that she heard men on a radio and by the way, this was 12 days after she went missing. She was found alive, for the record. But uh the story that she told is that she heard men on the path behind her talking on a radio, and she got afraid because they mentioned her name and she didn't recognize them, thinking it might be traffickers, which is a real thing.
Yep,
Uh,
I
so
remember this one
she,
now. Yeah, but yeah.
yeah, so she went into the woods basically on the run from them, and and apparently they or someone else kept after her for 12 days until finally she was found by a hunter, miraculously alive. So this one at least has a good ending in that sense. But
Mm-hmm.
uh, the weird thing about this story is that the police response to this was, nah, I think she's lying. Like, that's it. They did not investigate it at all. They did not look into the mysterious people who chased her through the woods for 12 days. They didn't investigate where she was. They did nothing.
Yep.
Like, so that's a weird one that I don't have an answer for. Like, don't get me wrong, you can explain that by incompetence as well, I suppose, but that leaves open the question of what was chasing her for 12 days. Traffickers absolutely would not have chased this woman for 12 days. It makes no sense. They would have, if she got away, if she made it too difficult for them to snatch, they would have just waited for some other single woman to be hiking by.
Yep.
Uh, right, so it clearly was not traffickers hunting her. So who was it?
Right.
Is the question. And the answer is we actually have no idea. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it could be supernatural, and I'm open to that possibility. It could be a completely different group of traffickers found her. It could be that she actually was only in trouble for the first couple of days, and then after that, she was hearing like voices or something.
Yeah.
Uh,
Panicked and
but
whatnot.
yeah, but we don't know because the police never investigated this,
Yep.
and it's like that's where it's incompetence as well, because it's like, why would you not investigate this? It's completely insane.
Right.
uh, what are they hiding is the question. Could it just be incompetence? I i mean, maybe, but it's just really really weird. Also, Lore Lodge calls the Appalachian Trail the Appalachian. I have never heard that before, and I don't like it. But apparently, Wendigoon said that Appalachian makes him sound like a Fed.
It
I
kind
just
of
wanted
does.
to reveal that story. I've only ever heard it called Appalachian before.
Yeah. So yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
go
There's a
ahead.
bunch of stuff with this stuff, where like recently I was listening through the Native Americans, well, First Nation in Canada, disappearances, and there's like a spot where where First Nation women just disappear and are never seen again. And it's pretty clear that there's a serial killer working who has specific things, and there's multiple sex pests in the area, and it's like, don't you think you should do something about it? And it's kind of a shrug, like, oh well. And it's very much like, uncaring, and this is Canadian more than American stuff, because in America, like, America does tend to treat missing people a bit more uh, carefully, but it's like just watching something being like deliberately uncaring, but in some of these disappearances in America, it's like, the whole people are out. You have hundreds of people, rangers and more. And there was this one kid who disappeared where rangers actually came out to help them find him. And somebody actually said, hey, look, we think we saw a kid being dragged off by a guy screaming. Um, but there's some counter information to that people, can sort of poke at. Was it a wild man? Wild men do have a certain amount of truck in Appalachian circles. Um, there's a lot of places that have just been forgotten by history, by civilization, by people. Uh, America is huge. It's huge. It takes hours just to get through Appalachia by driving uh, through a thin part. I firmly believe that there's plenty of weird stuff hidden in nooks and crannies across that area.
Yeah, the Lorla just talked about this. The thing about the Appalachian Mountains, and I've only ever heard them called that. I'm calling them that. The thing about the Appalachian Mountains is that they are massive, like way bigger than people realize that they are. There is an entire culture that is from like entirely in the Appalachians. Great, now he's got me saying it. Damn it, Ben. They got me.
Fed.
Uh,
Fed?
I know. Uh, Yo, you'd be surprised. I've gotten ads for this. It is incredibly easy to apply for FBI jobs. It's a little true story for you. Uh, but yeah, what people don't realize is that the Appalachians are like a massive culture, like completely different from the rest of the United States in the United States, right? Uh, Similar to this, it's sort of like the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. Actually, is kind of a similar phenomenon. But there's a big difference here. There's two big differences actually. First is that the Pineys, which is what people who live in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey are called, are just like there aren't as many of them for obvious reasons. And second is that the Pine Barrens has been shrinking for obvious reasons. The Appalachians have really not been. I mean, they have in a sense as they've been more industrialized, but we are nowhere near exhausting all of the possibilities of Appalachian resources. So that culture is still very much alive and very much its own thing. And people like just don't really know about this. It's kind of interesting. And that makes it really fun to use for things like Pinkerton's Ghost. You know, uh, it's almost like going into a foreign country in the middle of the country.
It's very interesting, especially since the Appalachian people uh, are closer to the original settlers than quite a few others. I know people have been talking about that in Twitter Spaces and stuff right now, thanks to that one Indian politician, but Indian American, I guess I should say, but not Native American, to be clear. Um, where he says we fought in the revolution. No, 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 dude. You were still in wherever you were, and that place was probably pretty awesome for you, but there's a difference between people who came over most recently, people who came over, 130 years ago, people who came over with the German migrations, which I share some ancestry with, and then people like, myself who were here before the revolution. You know, there are things that stuck in the culture longer than people kind of want to admit, because then it means that there's a question of, you know, Americans being of the same people and sort of thing. It's like, no, no, a lot of these things are, there's a lot of strangeness in them there hills instead of gold, if you get me.
Mm-hmm. And there's the fact that there was probably I'm trying to think of how to put it. Uh, Probably a lot of interbreeding with the Native Americans who were living there as well,
Without question.
which changes the flavor too. Uh, the whole flavor of the culture. Yeah, there's of these sorts of channels of like Lore Lodge, Wendigoon, whatever. I also found a recent one. I've mentioned him before, Jimmy Aiken, who's a Catholic apologist, but he actually has a show that is not related to apologetics, though he kind of tackles it sort of from a Catholic perspective. Uh, Called Jimmy Aiken's Mysterious World, where he tackles these sorts of cases, and you'd be surprised at the things that will sometimes crop up. One thing that I watch, and I'm gonna ask if you've heard of this, and I'm gonna bring it up now because it's an idea that we can maybe use this for Pinkerton's Ghost. The Versailles time slip. Does that mean anything to you?
Is that like the missing time?
The what?
The forgotten centuries, the missing centuries?
No, not that. Although that's a fascinating idea as well.
Yeah,
Uh, I think it's complete nonsense, but it's fun.
yes.
But it's interesting to use for fiction. Anyway, uh, so the Versailles time slip. There is a book, you can find it on Amazon right now, called An Adventure by two women. Uh, the book details two women who were living in Paris at the time. One of them was they ended up like becoming heads of the women's college at Oxford. Each of them, like separately, that was the career path that they were on. Uh, well, they were rooming together in uh, France, and they were walking in Versailles when something strange appeared to happen to them. Now, as they were walking, they noticed that the people around them were in period dress, or what they would later describe as period dress. And this took place in like I want to say the late 1800s, and the time that they were seeing the dress would have matched around the period of Marie Antoinette. Uh, so they go to a palace at Versailles, and the gardener there is in period dress. The accents of the people don't sound quite right. Uh, they converse with some of them, go through doors that don't exist anymore, and then just sort of leave and end up back in their time period. Uh, Later, one of the women investigates the area later and again sees someone there in period dress, though that only one person this time, and then she makes it back. They also discussed that they were feeling that they both felt separately extremely gloomy. They wrote their accounts of the incident separately, then compared them and found that they pretty much matched up with some minor details that you would expect when you have two different people telling the same story. Uh, and they published their accounts in a book called An Adventure that was a bestseller. And they originally published under pen names, then eventually under their real names. They published under pen names because they were the head of the Oxford Women's College. And the abiding question is, what was going on with this? So it's called the Versailles time slip because that's one of the prominent theories that they literally like for some reason there was some energy, there was some crack in the space-time continuum there that allowed them to slip into the past briefly and then make their way back into the present. Uh, but there are problems with this. By the way, I should mention that there is no it is very difficult to see how the women could be lying about the experience for a few reasons. First, we have private correspondence between the two of them, and they always talk about it like it's a real event, right? Like, always. Even in private, even with nobody else reading, uh, they talk about it as if it's a real event. Uh, the second reason that we really have no good reason to think that they would just not have a good reason to lie about it. Like, the book became a bestseller, but they had no idea that that would happen in advance. And if you were going to make up a best-selling book, why would you make it about something as boring as we talked to a few people, then went back? Like, it just doesn't make sense as a fictional story. Uh, and it could potentially hurt their reputations if they're lying. That's why they originally published it under a pen name. So probably something happened, though what is unclear. Uh, Now, the problem with the idea of a time slip is I would argue that, unfortunately and boringly, time travel into the past is literally impossible. Uh, I think that the grandfather paradox pretty much proves it. Uh, the grandfather paradox is everybody goes like you need a solution to the paradox. There is no solution. It's like saying you need a solution to 2 plus 2 not equaling 5. That's not how it works. 2 plus 2 equaling 5 proves that 2 plus 2 can only equal 4. Like, that's what it means. The grandfather paradox disproves time travel into the past. It's literally impossible. It would create a paradox. It's nonsensical, right? So
Right.
I don't think that that's what happened. There were other theories. We know it wasn't a. It probably was not a costume party. Now, one thing that was popular in Paris at the time was something called like a tableau, something I forget what it's called, but a living tableau. Basically, you would get people together, dress them in period dress, and arrange them into giant tableaus where they would be silent and unmoving to like create a sort of spectacle for people who walked by and saw it. And there was a guy there who was known as something of a dandy who liked to do these sorts of things with his friends and who might have like rented out that area for that day. Uh, there are two problems with this though. The first is that the whole point of this is that you are not moving and the women were talking and the women conversed with several of these people. Now, I personally don't think that that's as strong of an objection as people say it is, because it could have simply been that they were on a break, or it hadn't started yet, or they were in the midst of preparations.
Or they just
Uh,
thought it was funny to, mess around with people. They were French.
right, could be like seriously, it could genuinely be that too. So, however, the bigger problem is simply that like we have no evidence that that happened. Like the women's account is the only evidence, but this guy, like, he was a well-known figure in France at the time. That's why people knew about it to think of him later, and he just wasn't doing it that day. You know, so that becomes a problem for the theory. Uh, the other theories, you then have to get into things like supernatural theories because the insanity and hallucination theories are just not plausible at all. The whole idea of a shared hallucination is like it's something that people try and pull on mostly to disprove Christianity, frankly. Uh, the idea of shared hallucinations, it is not plausible. There is no shared hallucination in psychology. There is a sort of psychological illness called like folie à deux, which is like two people share a hallucination, but it's a completely different. But like what they're talking about is a completely different thing. It's not at all similar to what the women were experiencing. It would be more like you have a mental illness, you see something, and you talk your friend who also has a mental illness into seeing the same things that you do, right? Like, but that is an extremely niche thing, and it's not at all similar to what they were talking about. Uh, but the other problem, so I think that the natural explanations kind of use themselves up. I find the living tableau explanation to be the most plausible of the natural ones. Uh, like I said, the idea that they're not supposed to be talking to people isn't a very convincing rejoinder to me because again they could have walked in while they were on a break or before they had started or after they had ended, or they could have just been messing with them as you said. Uh, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the door that existed that shouldn't have existed, and it doesn't explain the fact that there is no record of this, despite the fact that the person who would have done this was like very open about what he did and when he did it. So the natural explanations don't seem plausible. An actual time slip also seems impossible to me, unless there's something about the nature of time that we genuinely are like completely we don't understand. But I think the grandfather paradox is pretty decisive uh, in destroying the idea of backwards time travel. So the other option then becomes something like a haunting. Now, in paranormal research, a haunting means something very specific. What a haunting means is that I'm trying to think of how to put it. Like, there is a record of a place and people that's sort of imprinted into a specific area. That is a haunting. Uh, so that could explain it, that they wandered into a haunting, and maybe these two women just so happened to be particularly perceptible to paranormal activity. Now, again, in one of, like I've mentioned, I believe in Fae. I happen to believe in ghosts. Uh, it's another one of those things where they have been reported so much throughout human history from time immemorial that prima facie, and they're still being reported today, that the idea of ghosts as a concept existing is plausible to me. And again, this idea that, oh, we've disproven ghosts because we now have cell phones with us and we haven't seen it. Well, there's enough events going on today that are just not explainable except through supernatural means that I find supernatural explanations the most plausible,
And quite
right?
frankly, people overestimate how easy it is to take a phone, take a video of something like that. You know.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I believe in ghosts. I don't know everything about, I don't have like a worked out theory of how they would work. Uh, from the Catholic, coming at it from a Catholic or Christian perspective, I've mentioned this even in Pinkerton's Ghost, but I tend to believe in like the three-tiered structure of ghosts. You have spirits from heaven, which generally only appear very briefly to give messages to loved ones. Uh, Spirits from hell, which generally appear to mess with people, or very, very rarely to also give messages like on orders of God, like to warn people, hey, I'm in hell, I wouldn't be here, but God made me. That is extremely rare. Uh, like, I can only really think of one story of this, and it's like a saint story, Uh, and it is not the norm. I do think that hell ghosts appear more often than ghosts from heaven, because I think that, generally speaking, ghosts from heaven just wouldn't have a reason to appear. Uh, but ghosts from hell, I think normally if you see them, it's to mess with people. And the Catholic perspective would call them purgatorial ghosts or something like that. But you might want to, if you don't like the terminology or the theology, you might want to just call them in between ghosts, which I think is the vast majority of them. Ghosts that are not damned, but for whatever reason are not able to move on. The classic type that you see in movies and things, right?
Mm.
Most movies and things. Uh, which, personally I would classify as something like purgatorial ghosts, that they are serving out, their purgatory in a sense in as ghosts, but you don't need to think of it in that way to make sense of the concept. Uh, the point being, the Versailles incident strikes me as, if this was something that was happening around the time of Marie Antoinette, that was a period of tremendous social upheaval in France, especially if it happened at a castle. And I do wonder if the people involved somehow got like caught up in the revolution or something. Uh, and that might be why there was a haunting. Now, the problem with the haunting theory is that traditionally in hauntings, they don't interact with people, but the women were being interacted with by the ghosts. So it could have been a mix. It could be that there were ghosts haunting it, that there were ghosts at that area that were interacting with the women, and it was a projection from the past that the women were like seeing. This strikes me as the most plausible of all of the explanations, that they somehow stumbled into an area that they were both just by coincidence, and with like millions and billions and billions of people throughout history, eventually something like this is plausible that it could happen. They were both unusually attuned to the spirit world, uh, which is a thing, it's a well known thing. And they were both unusually attuned to the spirit world, and they got caught up in this haunting, and there were also ghosts there that interacted with them, and then they, the haunting might have altered the place in some way, which, again, that is a thing that you see in rare circumstances, places altered by supernatural activity, or that people think are altered and aren't, which could also have been the case. uh, and that is probably what happened with them. But it's really fascinating because that is a very good example of the sort of incident where the natural answers just seem like they don't work, right? Like, they're
Yes.
all of the natural answers don't really seem to work. The most plausible of all of them is that tabula party theory. And while there is definitely, I think, some merit to that idea, there are too many pieces that aren't explained by it. Like why nobody could find evidence of it when people definitely looked, including them, by the way, including the two women. The two women were absolutely like, they were not inclined to think of this as supernatural. They were like, we need to figure out what happened. Like, they researched, was there a movie being filmed? Like, that was their impression of it. They were just like, I just want to know what happened. You know.
Mm.
Uh and the hallucination theory is just a very poor one. Like, there is nothing that would, explain this. There's no that's not how hallucinations work. It doesn't if it were a party, it doesn't explain how the architecture changed. But actual time travel into the past doesn't seem like it could work because of the grandfather paradox. Now, I suppose you could make the argument that if they were always going to go to that point in the past, then everything was proceeding the way that it should have been. But even that seems weird to me because that raises another question, which is how the people reacted to them. If, according to them, everybody else there was dressed unusually, then why did nobody comment on their dress? Like, wouldn't they have been the unusually dressed ones? And yet, it seems as if people were just talking to them. So, did their dress change? Like, what's going on?
Right.
Uh, Interesting stuff. So, these are the sorts of things that I think they are rarer than I think some of the more, I want to say conspiracy minded, but that seems like it's being needlessly provocative. So,
Mm.
the more supernaturally minded would like to believe, perhaps, but they absolutely do still happen, right? These unexplained and
Right.
unexplainable events, except through the supernatural. The missing 411 phenomena, I think most of the cases are probably just examples of like national park and state police malpractice,
Yes.
but some of them can't be, right? And
Right.
some of them, even if that is what they are, it's like, but that still leaves the question open of what exactly happened.
Yep. And it's not about the you know the oh, this person was a depressive something something. It's about, hey, they still disappeared and they didn't leave a suicide note. There was no text from their phone. Thanks for everything. Etc. Which is a meme format nowadays. I don't know if you know this, but basically it's like when your homie sends you the text, and he just drops the phone, and then Black Betty plays while he runs across town to get to his friend, and it's like, oh, that's dark. But yeah, no, like it's some of these guys, it's like they reach for something. It's like I don't think some of these guys who they talk to are as suicidal or whatever, that people say they are. It's like, well, his girlfriend shows up. Oh, he was depressed. And so you were fine with him disappearing into the woods for weeks on end? Like the fellow who disappeared looking for that cave. His girlfriend's like, "Oh, he was kind of depressed." And it's like this was somebody who went out, looking to prove something and was trying not to stop until um, he actually finished it. It that's
I got a fun one for you that makes me think of it. So, do you know the story of Meriwether of how Meriwether Lewis died?
Oh, yes, but tell the story. Tell the story. Tell the story.
So, my full details on this are a little hazy, but my understanding is that Meriwether Lewis, and let me preface this by saying the really fascinating thing about this story is that both explanations sound very plausible, prima facie, right? Like that people give for what happened. So, the official story is that Meriwether Lewis shot himself. Uh, Now, here is what we know about Meriwether Lewis. He was a terminally depressed man. This is true. And unlike some of these other people, it's like, oh, they were depressed. Like, no, he struggled with this throughout his life. There is a very famous line from his journals when he was on the. And this is, by the way, Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expeditions for people not following. So he like mapped out the entire Pacific half of the country with his partner Clark. They didn't lose a single man on the journey except one to dysentery. Uh, Otherwise, nobody else died, so he's an American hero, right? Meriwether, and he's a remarkable person. Well, Meriwether Lewis very famously in his journals, he turned 30 at some point on the trip, and it's still insane to even think about when you read it. Like, he says something along the lines of, I've turned 30, like, what am I doing with my life? I'm already 30. In the middle of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is like, how? Uh, And I've seen people try and downplay this, like, oh, people exaggerate that point. Like, no, I'm sorry, you can't downplay that. That's a depressed man writing that. I don't buy attempts to downplay that. Like, you cannot write that in a mentally well place when you're in the middle of one of the most historically important expeditions in the history of the world. Uh, and you're wondering about your place in life. That is a sign of mental illness. So,
Yes,
uh,
and they knew how important it was too. Like there wasn't any question that this was an important thing that they were doing.
Right. The only way that you could possibly say that is if you had some sort of mental issue. So I don't buy attempts that people try and downplay it. I'm like, no. No, you can't downplay that. That's an insane thing to say. Like,
Right.
I love Meriwether Lewis, but that's an insane thing to say. Literally insane. It's mentally ill. So Lewis was known, is what I'm saying, like, for suffering from depression. He would go through bouts of it, as people do, right?
Yes.
It gets more severe, it gets less severe. Clark knew it. Well, I am going off of memory, but he was staying in a cabin with a woman. Her husband was not home, but she was known for like keeping people there. But her husband was out, is my recollection. When the woman hears a shot, and Meriwether Lewis, it appears, has shot himself. Now, when she interviews him about it, he's like kind of, or the woman talks to Lewis about it. She lays him up. She does her best, but they're kind of isolated, so, it's hopeless. He's going to die. And Lewis seems to be kind of raving, according to the woman. Like, it's not really clear if, and when she asks him if he shot himself, he says something like, I guess I did, or something along those lines. Uh, Now, when you learn about like the details of the story, Lewis shooting himself does seem plausible. He was depressed, he was alone, right? He was waiting for people, but he was isolated, and that's never good for depressed people. With that said, and when they told Clark about it, Clark's response, like, I believe that there was a rumor that Lewis had killed himself years earlier, and he hadn't. And Clark's response at that point was like, "Yeah, I figured that would happen one day." Honestly, uh, which is sad. Like I'm not even laughing at. That's just kind of sad, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, like William Clark, and it turned out it was a false. At the time, it was a false rumor, but that lends some credence to the idea that this is the sort of thing that Lewis could potentially do, because
Yes.
Clark, for obvious reasons, was very close with it. Uh, so, however, there was a theory that came out later that like grew and grew in plausibility, that there was a visitor to the cabin. I forget who it was. I'm gonna have to look this up to see. Meriwether Lewis death, blah, 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 who might have done it. In fact, there are two theories of who might have killed him. The woman who was running the cabin, of course, is actually under suspicion, uh, because she's the last person to see him alive.
Right.
And there was supposedly somebody who like was a known enemy of Lewis who visited the cabin. Uh, so this is the problem with this whole thing. The fascinating thing about Lewis's death is that like both stories sound very plausible depending on who is telling you the story, right? Like if you listen to a clever storyteller, they can make the suicide option sound like the only possible option, and they can make the murder option sound like the only possible option. So I'm going to read the section of Wikipedia on analysis of it. Don't worry, I'll paraphrase. But the only doctor to examine Lewis's body did not do so until 40 years later. So this makes it this is a big problem in itself. The impression had long prevailed that Lewis died by his own hand. The commission that examined his body said it seems more probable that he died by the hands of an assassin. So part of the problem with this is that the way that the bullet would have entered him, and the way like the angle of the bullet and the angle of the shot, makes it seem like it would be a really strange way for Lewis to shoot himself. Uh, in the book The History of the Lewis and Clark Exposition, printed in 1893, the editor expressed doubt about Jefferson's conclusion that Lewis had committed suicide. Uh, From 1993 to 2010, about 200 of Lewis's kin sought to have the body examined for forensic analysis, and a Tennessee coroner's jury in 1996 recommended exhumation. Uh, the Department of the Interior approved it, but rescinded that decision in 2010, stating that the decision is final. So, the Lewis family has been begging the National Park Service to approve an exhumation, but his tomb is a national monument, so they've just kept refusing and kept refusing. And finally, in 2010, the Department of the Interior refused and said it's final. Now, I don't know how they can confirm that it's final. Like, if somebody else raises the question years later, somebody could change their mind. Also, that's just really suspicious. Like, why would they refuse it? Uh, so, the historian Paul Russell Cuthright wrote a detailed rebuttal of the murder robbery theory, concluding that lacks legs to stand on. Uh, and this refutation was countered by Dr. Eldon Chinard, a physician, who argued for the murder hypothesis on the basis that Lewis's wounds were inconsistent with his 2-hour survival after the shooting. This particular medical theory, as well as others, have been explored in their book So Hard to Die. Leading Lewis scholars have stated that the facts of his death are not known. There are no eyewitnesses, and the reliability of reports of those in the place or the vicinity cannot be considered certain. Uh, so, what I am saying is the really fascinating thing about Lewis's death is that we still genuinely don't know. So, on one hand, it is plausible that Lewis is the sort of person who would have committed suicide and might have been in the mental state to do it. But on the other hand, the wounds that Lewis suffered seem to make it very unlikely that he would have survived as long as he did from a shot at point blank range that would have been what was required if he shot himself. Like, the
I gotcha.
depending on who you talk to, like, it's really weird. Whoever you talk to will tell you, like, that, both, they can make either story sound very plausible. Also, sadly, Lewis was a Freemason. I just want to mention
No,
he is on the list of notable Freemasons.
that's probably why they killed him.
Could be. Uh,
You have to understand, people. Anytime there's a Freemason, it's immediately a Masonic plot, just the same as a Jesuit. It's a Masonic
yep.
plot until proven otherwise.
So, since we're on the subject of like these sorts of conspiracy things, I have talked to people who know and have talked to real Freemasons. The truth is, and we do hint at this in Pinkerton's Ghost a little bit, most Freemasons in real life are actually quite boring people.
Yes.
Uh, and this is true of most evil, frankly. Most evil is boring. But the Freemasons as an organization, like they are a very real secret like semi-secret at least,
Yep.
organization, and they absolutely like the Catholic Church has written like many anti-Freemason encyclicals claiming that it is incompatible with the faith,
Yep.
and I think that they are right to do so. Uh, and they absolutely have in the past been involved in plots, but for the most part, probably a good 95+% of Freemasons that you deal with are just going to be old men who want to belong to a social club.
Yep.
Uh, we even hint at this a little bit in Pinkerton's Ghosts with our distinction between Grand Masons and Freemasons.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, honestly, even Pinkerton's Ghosts were probably making them out to be a little bit more of a threat than they actually are in real life.
Yes.
Because in real life, they're really just like they're dull. They're very dull people. They're like vaguely. I guess the stereotype of a Freemason would just be like old men who want to belong to a social club like the Elks or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's,
Uh.
I don't want
Yeah.
to make
Go ahead.
this a Freemason stream because, like, it takes time to talk about it, but I can certainly put it on the docket. But the thing with the Freemasons is that if you go up to anyone and say, "Oh well, you're anti-Christian," they will have no idea what you're talking about. And it's like, well,
Yep.
some of the rituals say we should pursue truth, that we should seek truth. And of course, the context that we would understand is your own truth. Oh, Jesus Christ is just one truth about many, that sort of thing. But the thing is, it doesn't start with, like, you don't start off with a goat and a Baphomet statue and all that jazz. You start off some friends and you barbecue and you have some fun, and these are your buddies, and your buddies, only a fifth degree or something like that. He doesn't actually see it, and but let's say you enter it, by the time you make it to the last degrees a normal person can reach, you've already agreed to so many different truth muddlers that you don't know where you started from. The things that they talk about, like with truth, with other things like that, is satanic, not in the sh- not in the fire, but in the slow burn leading up to it. And to pretend otherwise, doesn't really do anything for anybody here. Like, you can say, well, I don't see this, I don't see that. But the thing is that you wouldn't see it. It takes time to develop, and because it takes time to develop, your judgment on it is different than what you would really prefer to see, which is quite unfortunate.
Yeah. The other thing too is that we've meant like I am as far as historical figures I am a fan of. One of my favorites has always been George Washington and still is. George Washington was a Freemason. This is a fact. He was fairly prominent in the Freemasons. However, George Washington being prominent in the Freemasons probably meant that uh, he ran social meetings and didn't think about the other aspects of it.
Yep.
And I say this because, quite frankly, we just don't have any historical evidence that, like, Washington was out there like pushing Masonic conspiracy
Mhm.
theories or anything. People love to they they almost as far as I can tell they almost wish that was true, right?
Right.
Like people
Yes.
love to push that, but we just don't have any evidence of it. Oh, there's an eye on the pyramid. Uh, in fact, I'm actually going this isn't just on Masons, so it's not on the topic of Masons only. I'm
Mm.
actually going to talk about this briefly because it's like kind of a big deal to me, and I've had arguments with people over this. I once had an argument with someone on John C. Wright's blog that was trying to argue that old school Disney, like Walt Disney, the actual man, his old stuff, was like anti-Christian, had secret Masonic propaganda smuggled in symbols. And here is my problem with this. Uh, First, I actually think that Walt Disney is a genuine hero. Like he was one of the great men of American history. He was an anti-communist. He believed in the nuclear family. He believed in promoting good values. He believed in the value of civilization. This is not something like people have said when I've tried to defend Disney later that I have some sort of like it's because I have an emotional attachment to him. I did not. I came to this conclusion after researching him. I did not have this. I was not like wed to this idea. If Disney did not deserve to be praised, I would not be praising him. You can believe me or not, but that's the truth. Yeah. So they have pointed to things in his movies, and specifically Fantasia was pointed at. A cartoon called Donald Duck in Math Magic Land was another. That they say have secret occult symbolism that demons use to get a
Mhm.
foothold in, and that secretly is indoctrinating people with the symbols. My problem is that like symbols themselves aren't magic. What people don't realize is that all of the symbols of the Masons, of these occult organizations, are stolen from the Christians.
Yes.
Like, historically, they always have been. The pentagram is a Christian symbol, it stands for the five wounds of Christ. Like, did you know that? That's where it comes from. It's the five wounds of Christ. The upside down cross is a Christian symbol. It's known as the St. Peter's cross. It flies outside the Vatican. Uh, and it comes from an old legend about Saint Peter that he was. I don't think that we've ever confirmed this, but it's a very old legend that he was crucified upside down.
It's
Right? It's called
the
the Saint
Romans
Peter
were
cross.
pretty clear on how things were done, even though I like to think it's real.
Oh, it's a great story.
A great story.
And we do, and it doesn't really matter if it's real or not. Like Peter was
Yes.
one of the, is one of the two apostles that we are absolutely certain was martyred, along with James.
Yep.
And Paul, he's not one of the 12, but he calls himself an apostle. Paul is also another one that we're absolutely certain was martyred. The others, there were legends that came down about their martyrdom, but technically speaking, we're not really sure.
Right.
But Peter, Paul, and James, we are 100% certain were martyred. So
Mm.
whether he was actually crucified upside down, who knows?
Mm.
Probably not, but it is a great story. Either way, like that symbol of the upside down cross is the St. Peter's cross. So what I am saying is, if somebody had a movie like say Fantasia that had otherwise Christian messages, which it absolutely did, A Night on Bald Mountain is as explicitly Christian as I've ever seen anything be. Frankly, uh, it's one of the most explicitly the Night on Bald Mountain followed by the Ave Maria is one of the most explicitly Christian sequences that I've seen in cinema. Uh, like if you have these very, very explicitly Christian messages, but you're mixing in the subtle symbology. Like, that's not how symbols work. You know, those symbols could also just be Christian symbols. Like, even if you didn't mean them that way, unless you knew that they weren't Christian symbols, they don't, like, magically turn you into a Mason. You don't watch the Night on Bald Mountain sequence, which is about the devil being defeated by monks singing matins at the beginning of the day, which is the morning prayer, going out of the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you don't make that, but then go, oh, but I saw a pentagram and I saw, right? Like, and I
Yeah.
saw, I don't know, some other Masonic symbol and go, you know, I understand that the devil was defeated by Christians singing the morning prayer, but now I just really want to be a Mason. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's completely nonsensical. Uh,
I've been listening. I've been listening to Ancient Aliens, and I think I should become a Mason.
yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't happen like that. Um, mate, so to be clear to people, Masons are friends and family. I once dated a girl who was of a Masonic line, like an ancient one. Uh, they know this because they found her grandmother's stuff, which was witchy, as well as the personal misfortune she and her family often had. And we're not talking like, oh no, something bad happened. We're talking chased down by her boyfriend in the middle of a busy highway. Um, kind of crazy. Uh, and the scars to prove it. Uh, so it's like, yeah, I believe, some ancestor of your family played a game and won a stupid prize. Um, my family had some, but my grandfather, my father's side, kept us out of it. Um, so there's choices that can be made by people, uh, but the amount of people in Masonic whatever for Satanism or something. No, not that many.
yeah, it's like Donald Duck in Mathemagic Land is a good example. If you watch it, it's like they mention Pythagoreans and they mention and Donald has like a symbol of a pentagram on his hand and wears a wizard hat, and everybody freaks out over this cartoon. Like, oh, it's all of these clear, Masonic symbolism and occult symbolism. But like my problem with this is that it's about like the value of math. Yeah, right? Like
Right.
all of these symbols are there, and like, yeah, okay, I guess I could see the argument, like maybe the people who put them there, like maybe some of Disney's animators, had researched some occult stuff and put it in there to make it feel more organic, which I could understand not being comfortable with it. But it's also like, if you are a child who doesn't know what a that pentagram is a cult, it doesn't make you a cult. It's a Christian symbol fundamentally, right? Like, it is the
Yes.
symbol of the five wounds of Christ. So just seeing the symbol doesn't make you a cult. Like, seeing a wizard's hat, like, legitimately somebody tried to argue with me on John's blog that the monks walking in from mountains uh were not necessarily monks. They look kind of like wizards. And John responded, that's like saying that robots look kind of like knights. Like, that's a like, no, they don't. They look like monks. They very clearly look like monks.
Yes.
Like, they're singing the Ave Maria, which is an ancient Christian prayer. Like, very, ancient, I guess is relative, medieval, right?
Mm.
Uh, One of the most, like, leaving aside if you like the song or not, like, it is even the Hail Mary. It's Latin for Hail Mary, which is a biblical quote. You know, uh, like, that's not Masonic. Uh, I don't know. It bothers me, and it bothers me too because I see people who are now uh, avoiding things that are good because of this very weird fear that these very subtle symbols will like worm into people's brains. Uh,
Right.
and it's just bizarre. Like, we had somebody on, David Breckenridge, who was talking about Disney, and there were patterns that I was spotting in Disney's work. And the patterns were that Disney was extremely pro family, extremely, right? Like, very
Yeah.
explicit about it. He was extremely pro civilization. You see this in 20,000 Leagues. You see this in Swiss Family Robinson. Like that, he was very pro, like, between the wilds and civilization. He came on the side of civilization, right?
Yes.
And Disney was trying to push this. And just generally speaking, Disney was always about uh like real families. If that, I hope that makes some sense.
Right.
Like
Not found
he was,
families.
yes, even when they were wounded in some way, it was the wound that would think of like the Parent Trap, right? Like the Parent Trap was about it's an old Disney movie that was literally about forming a nuclear family, right? Like that's the premise of the movie. That their family is incomplete. One does not have a father, one does not have a mother, and to become complete, they need to form a nuclear family. You know, or you get something like in Bambi and Dumbo and Pinocchio. They're arguing like, oh, Pinocchio was actually Masonic. The original Pinocchio was Masonic, but the Pinocchio in that Disney released was, like C.S. Lewis talks about Pinocchio as a Christian allegory himself. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I really see no reason that you should see Pinocchio in a Masonic way. It's true that the original author might have intended to write him that way, but frankly, nobody has adapted the original author's Pinocchio.
Yep.
Like, it's sort of like Frankenstein. Nobody has adapted the original Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Nobody has adapted
Yep.
I forget his name, the original Pinocchio. They like the idea of Pinocchio and they adapt that idea in various ways. Like, to assume that because he might have written it as Masonic propaganda that Disney must have just is not plausible to me.
Yep.
It's completely different.
Yeah,
I
and
mean, you get
it
something like the Pleasure I sorry, go ahead.
and there's things like not all symbols have meaning. Some are just a really cool idea done by some artist who uh you know thought why not, like it's as simple as that. Why not? Why not put this in here? And it's like, but it's a Masonic thing. And it's like, no, like nobody cares. Nobody notices until you point it out. Like there was this one, I think it was the Rescuers Down Under or something, where it's like somebody put a pornographic image in one of the windows of an apartment. Like I've seen that movie. I've got a really old copy. I used to have a really old copy, I should say. Uh, I have no idea what you're talking about. I never saw it.
Well, yeah, you need to freeze the movie at a certain point, and animators will sometimes do things like that because, frankly, animation is a very boring job. Uh,
Yep,
you need to draw like lots and lots of very slight variations on the exact same image.
yep,
So I can easily imagine an animator being very bored drawing a nude woman for one shot as an inside joke to his friends. Yeah.
yep.
Uh, it's literally impossible to notice unless you freeze frame that moment in the movie. Uh, it moves too fast for you to see it. It's one frame. Uh, but yeah, like there's also the thing like Lion King. Supposedly when they do "Can You Feel the Love Tonight," the leaves spell out sex, and then they say, "Well, no, it's not. It's SFX." Uh, and I honestly, I think that it was probably meant to be meant to be sex. I don't buy the SFX explanation as much.
Animators
Uh,
are also horny.
yeah, but it's also like one of those things where, like, with that said, yes, I would show kids Lion King. It's like, it's very bored animators wrote something in because, like you said, that they're horny and bored, and it was a joke. Uh, do I think that they should have done it? No, but whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not gonna lose sleep over it.
Yep.
Sabonatic asks, so people have seeded these symbols to them out of fear. Oh, seeded as in CEDED. Okay, okay, I get what you're saying. It's more like in the modern world, people have forgotten the original meaning of these symbols. Also, it's just so people take them and then use them, and people forget that they were originally Christian symbols. Also,
Mm-hmm.
this is just something that Gnostics historically have always done. you have to remember that the enemy can't create, right?
Yep.
And Tolkien, this is the famous Tolkien quote. They said it with, that they kept spamming on Rings of Power because it's just so fitting. Like, they can only corrupt what is already there. So they have no creativity of their own. They have no ability to create symbols of their own. And if you think about it, it doesn't even make sense that they would have that power because God created the world as good. Anything that they're using is ultimately from God. Uh, you can only pervert it. You can't create it. God creates, and God creates good things, right? Like, it's not how it works,
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, they picked the pentagram because the pentagram was an obscure Christian symbol from the Middle Ages that had fallen out of favor. So they figured most people had forgotten about it, and they were right. Same with the St. Peter's cross. They thought, hey, a cross is good. If you flip it upside down, it's not so good. Like, that's it. That is the
Mm-hmm.
level of creativity we're dealing with here. These people are not rocket scientists.
Yeah. It's like Satanism sounds good with Aleister Crowley, like all the different stuff, but in reality, he's like, oh, our women dates aren't wearing bras. We might have an orgy later with our committed life partners that we share. Ooh, and it's like, no, tell that to they were basically like making fun of proper society, not fighting the power, so to say.
Yeah, I have a really great book that I actually recommend. It is called The Politically Incorrect Guide to English and American Literature. Sounds like a boomer title. I expected a kind of boomer book, and I was very pleasantly surprised at how good it was.
Yeah.
So I recommend it. Uh, but right, the title comes across as too boomer to me. I don't like the title, but it's part of like a series of politically incorrect books. However, it is quite a good book. Uh, they have a section in there on Marlowe, who wrote. Trying to remember. What's the famous devil story that he wrote? Trying to remember.
You
What's the? Am I thinking of the right
Paradise
guy?
Lost? I don't think you're thinking of the right guy.
I might be thinking of. He was a playwright at the time
Yes.
of Shakespeare. He
You mean Milton?
No, not Milton. Milton was a poet, and he was not Shakespeare's son.
Oh, yeah. No, it is Morley then.
Marlowe.
Marlowe.
Uh, Trying to remember who wrote Faust, the play Faust.
A lot
So
of people.
Faust disambiguation. Blah blah blah. Faust film and television, music, theater. Uh, Man, I cannot find it.
Philip
Oh, maybe
Marlowe
I'll find it
might
though.
be the right person for it.
Either way, the point is, he wrote these stories that were. He's often considered like the. Let me put it in politically incorrect so I can see if I can find it. By the way, the author of the book is Elizabeth Cantor. Uh, just for the record, the 17th century, chapter 5. Dryden, Victorian literature. Nope, 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 nope. Old English. Nope. Medieval. Nope. Renaissance. Christopher Marlowe. That's who
Oh,
I was thinking of. So I actually did get the last name right.
yeah.
Uh, so Christopher Marlowe, and let me look up so I can find his play, because this is an important point actually. Like, it gets to what I'm saying. He would be considered, I think nowadays, he would be part of like the avant-garde. Yeah, Christopher Marlowe. He wrote Tamburlaine. Uh, he died mysteriously, and his most famous work was lyric career plays. No, I'm right. I think it is Faust. I think I'm actually right. Let's see if I am. He wrote Dia. Yeah, Dr. Faustus. Damn,
Hmm.
I actually remembered it correctly. Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. Ha ha ha. Alright, so it's an Elizabethan tragedy by Christopher Marlowe. Now, if you were to look up Christopher Marlowe, uh, by the way, Sabonitic says the answer is to maintain that knowledge to keep it from falling into the unknown where it's all possibilities. Uh, yeah, I guess. Try not to lose that knowledge, right? I think that's a good. I think that's a good solution. And also, is the word stewardship? Nope, I found it. It's Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. So, if you look up Christopher Marlowe, he would be considered nowadays uh, something like, he would probably be considered a Satanist. Uh, he was like a radical who was one of the early radicals. He would say things like, I'm evil for the sake of being evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I think? I think that Jesus Christ was gay, that sort of thing, right?
Mm.
Like, and he would say stuff like that. Uh, but here is the interesting thing about Marlowe. Marlowe, in a sense, understood evil much better than the moderns who promote it, because he knew that he was evil. That was like almost the point. you know, that was the fun of it. The fun of it was that he was evil. And he was gonna show you that he was evil, right? And if you didn't think he was evil, he would be insulted. Because he would be incredibly, he was incredibly radical. And yet, it's hard to say how a lot of what he did that he considered radical and evil that people nowadays would not consider that way. Now, Faustus is, of course, a story about someone who sells his soul to the devil, right? Uh, for 24 years of power and pleasure, during which he is to be assisted and entertained by Mephistopheles. But the thing about Faustus that makes Marlowe so much wiser than modern people is that while Faustus is portrayed as, in some ways, a figure that you can admire, someone who has sought, in a Nietzschean way, sought after power and seized it, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and who did what he had to do to get what he wanted and damn the consequences. Ultimately, Faustus is dragged into hell. It's revealed as a foolish choice. His will is not strong enough to control events. Uh, as I'm reading here, the chorus closes the play with a summation of Faustus's tragic career. Cut is the branch that might have grown full straight, and burn it is Apollo's laurel bow. Uh, right? So he seemed to understand that if you were going to be evil, if you were going to seize power, you were ultimately a doomed man, a damned man, in fact, right?
Yes.
You were damning yourself. And Marlowe knew that and accepted it. Contrast this with moderns who try and pretend that they can be like Faustus or be like Marlowe, but not accept those consequences. In that very real sense, Marlowe is actually more admirable, right? Because at least Marlowe knew what he was and accepted it.
Still an edgy teenager sounding kind of guy.
Yeah,
Doesn't.
well, that's exactly what he was. But he says he seems to have had a lot in common with his villain heroes. His short life ended almost as violently as any of theirs. He was stabbed in the face by a government agent in highly mysterious circumstances.
Wow.
There is good evidence that he was an atheist, a spy working for the Secret Service that Francis Walsingham ran for Queen Elizabeth. Look up Francis Walsingham, nasty individual. Uh, but there's good evidence he was an atheist, a spy working for the Secret Service that Francis Walsingham ran for Queen Elizabeth, and a proponent of pederasty. Government informers testified that Marlowe proselytized for atheism and sexual vice, and Marlowe's poetry itself is evidence of the fact that he found atheism, magic, male sexuality, and Machiavellian scheming powerfully attractive. If Marlowe, this is where it gets interesting though. if Marlowe wasn't an atheist, his atheism wasn't in the mold of the calmly superior Enlightenment 19th century rationalist. He
Mm.
was disseminating an outrageously blasphemous alternative story about Christ and apostles, sort of like the Da Vinci Code, but much more so. Uh, and his homosexuality wasn't along the lines of, I only want civil rights so I can visit my longtime partner in the hospital, folks. It was in the style of the 10% is not enough, recruit, recruit, recruit crowd. Uh, so it's easy to see why they would the modern devotees of queer theory and transgression would be fans of Marlowe, and Marlowe was just their kinds of artist. Uh, but the problem with this, they says, but outrageous or nasty Marlowe-like characters are not all there is in Marlowe's plays, and the plays themselves are not simply angry attacks on the moral and the religious structure of the Elizabethan worldview, or attempts to queer the audience's understanding of right and wrong. Uh, they are plays. There are plays in English that are nothing about but challenging morality and religion, but they're not anything like as good as Marlowe's plays. There are many reasons that The Jew of Malta and Dr. Faustus are great works of literature. While, say, Tennessee Williams, if you've ever heard of him, by the way, that's the gay man who wrote Cat on the Hot Tin Roof. Uh, I say gay man because it's notable in this case for what we're talking about. Uh, he wrote Night of the Iguana, which was about challenging Western sexual morality, is not. And he shares Marlowe's hostility towards religion and conventional standards of right and wrong. Chief among the reasons that Marlowe's play is great, while Tennessee Williams isn't, is that the things that Marlowe's blaspheming characters rage against don't all get knocked down in his plays. Uh, the art of blaspheming revolt against religion and morality yields diminishing returns. Marlowe could get lots of bang for his buck because he was writing when almost everyone took God, his commandments, and the salvation of their own souls very seriously, and Tennessee Williams was writing when skepticism about religion and widespread sexual immorality was increasingly a matter of convention and prudence rather than religious belief.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's where you get from they mention here, this is why this is actually a really good book. Like I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says that the Vagina Monologues was written 40 years after The Night of the Iguana and is several rungs below it on the scale of literary value. It was created in the era of Piss Christ and the elephant dung studded collage of the Virgin Mary at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. uh, so now they're just trying to get attention by violating any religious taboos or sensibilities. But Marlowe wrote his plays in a moral and religious world. And some of their most powerful moments are about what Marlowe's characters lose by embracing atheism and vice. And that's what Dr. Faustus is about, the poignancy of this loss. And they even go on to say Marlowe could hardly have made Faustus's choice to damn himself seem more foolish. Uh, right?
Yes.
So that's the difference between these two. Marlowe was writing this in a world where everybody knows that God exists. Everybody believes in religion. Everybody takes these ideas very seriously, and he's writing about these characters who don't. And these characters who don't then are suffering for that fact. And Marlowe accepted this, right? Like he was a genuine artist for all of his many flaws. You know, he had the heart of an artist, and the heart of an artist, a true artist, should be an honest heart, right?
Yes.
Uh, you're looking into human nature and you're saying something real about it. So Marlowe recognized that when he is rebelling against uh, human nature, religion, all of dignity, it's ultimately not going to end well for him, right? But
Mm-hmm.
he spits in the face of your god. That's the idea, you know. Better to be a slave and a king in hell than a slave in heaven, right?
Right.
When you get to people like Tennessee Williams, and then Tennessee Williams in The Night of the Iguana says something like, all your Western theologies are based on the concept of God as a senile delinquent. And it's like, Okay, so in the early 1960s, maybe that was profound, but it's now just like that was literally the premise of the Golden Compass, and it's also why it fell apart, as
Yep.
John C. Wright pointed out. It fell apart because God is a senile delinquent. It's not fun to rebel against that guy. You
Yes.
know, like there is nothing to like. So you're rebelling against a senile delinquent. So what?
Yeah.
Anybody can do that. I can do that. You can do that. There's nothing to it. There's no there's nothing admirable about it. But when Faustus commands the devils to give him power and glory and fame, you could see why he would do that even while you're showing why that's a mistake. But now you've even lost that aspect of it.
Yep.
Anything you want to say, Ben, since we're at 8:56?
Yeah. I mean, it's the thing with these guys is they they have a lot less to say than they think. Like it's like recently I watched a movie called Spine of the Night or something like that. I don't really recommend it to everyone. I've got a stomach for non-sexualized nudity, so like seeing random naked people doesn't do anything for me. But if you are sensitive to that, do not do that on your faith. Um, but the one of the big reveals is that their world, their fantasy world, which is being torn apart by a man who is consuming the blood of a god in flower form for immense power, is built on the corpse of a dead father god, whose children gods were killed by humans who are now like gods themselves, sometimes under certain circumstances. But the thing is that there was, father gods before the father god, and father gods before the father god, and father gods before the father god, and father gods before the father gods. There was an infinite cycle of dead gods behind them, and now an infinite cycle of dead humans before them. It's and it was done very well. All right, it was done better than I can say, because in the end, the evil sorcerer king is killed along with anyone who used the plant, but the plant itself is spread out again throughout the lands. And the thing about that, why I think that's fairly profound, isn't because, you know, and this was an animation, isn't because like the villain god is just desserts. It's that no, the power was real. The power was legitimate. People used it time and time again throughout history. The witch burns a guy's face off with it. She could never use its full power because she was just a swamp witch, but like she had legitimate power. She could tell the future. She brought forth things from the flame, blew up a wall, like, and then the guy who actually like studied it deeply, unlocked the power and became like a god and was killed, like the other gods before him. And you see that there's a cycle that's the world is going through that's much more interesting than simply, oh, nothing matters, oh, whatever atheist thing you want. While there isn't anyone really good in the series except for one or two people, evil is constantly being made to pay. Uh, like people who cannot, fight with the times and stuff like that are dragged through the mud. Peasants who refuse to help themselves are dragged through the mud. Like evil people get their just desserts constantly. Um, and to and the implication, of course, is that the gods themselves were evil, or at the very least uncaring, mostly uncaring. Uh, to me, that's much more interesting. And this movie came out in 2021, I think, than something like, oh well, just let me do what I want, man, or what does it matter to you, or there's no God, or anything like that. It's self-contained. It's interesting. It's worth thinking about. Not in the sense of denial of God, but in the sense of cycles of evil and violence. Over some power, over something. You know, it had an honest appearance to the work. This person, I have no idea what their morality is, but certainly had no problem not flinching away from the very thought he was putting it into being. It is a thing of despair, but it's not a thing that um, is as despairing as people say. Good people in the end made tough choices and won out. Um, everyone died, but the flowers are still out there and people are still out there. There were many deeds of heroism throughout the movie, like true heroism. Uh, like you look through it as a piece of art, and then you compare it to any of the Star Wars movies, Go Set a Watchman, any of the things that attack quote unquote normalcy. Well, they're making fun of something that doesn't exist anymore. Like Wasp America is dead. It's going to be dead. Nothing's going to bring it back. What are you making fun of? We're poking the eye of the patriarchy. Like the patriarchy's gone. There's just psychos. It's sociopaths all the way down. Sociopaths and psychopaths eating sociopaths and psychopaths. I've worked under them. They are entirely without self-reflection. They don't care. They'll fire somebody who needs a job through no fault of their own other than they were told to or it made monetary sense, and then go, hey buddy, why are you walking in front of your woman, sort of thing. Why are you walking in front of your girl? That's not right. That's not how you do it. And I've seen this with my own eyes. We are in a faithless generation. There's nothing to mock, there's nothing to tear down. So why are you still screaming and kicking? Well, the answer is that unlike in the spine of the world, our God doesn't die. Jesus Christ rose from the grave. The saints are all the saints, are in heaven now. You can't tear that down. You can make up all these different things. You can infiltrate Christian circles. You can have atheists become priests. You can have atheists become pastors. You can do all this stuff, but is all it does is keep the cycle of suffering to continue. My pastor had a good point today in his sermon. Uh, you know, he said, Christ won, but the enemy's still moving. And that's very true. Uh, and quite frankly, Satan's never going to retreat. He's going to continue fighting till the bitter end, and people will accept an explicit Satan rather than a living, loving, holy God. Hmm. All right, Anthony, you good?
Yep, final thoughts. I'm glad that Miyazaki's newest movie is doing very well in Japan, and they said it'll be coming out in America later this year. Woohoo!
What movie?
Miyazaki's newest film. It's going to be released in English as The Boy and the Heron, but it's called How Do You Live?
Excellent. All right.